She was always smiling. Not the kind of smile that flickers or fades, but the kind that convinces a room everything is fine, even when it isn't. On television screens across America, Egypt Sherrod appeared confident, polished, unshakable. A voice that commanded attention. A presence that radiated certainty. A woman who looked like she had figured it all out. But smiles can be armor. And sometimes, the strongest armor hides the deepest wounds. For years, Egypt carried a truth she never shared, not because she didn't have a story, but because the world wasn't listening for pain. It was listening for inspiration. It wanted the highlight reel, not the cost. The success, not the sacrifice. The finished product, not the breaking point. Behind the cameras, there were nights when exhaustion spoke louder than applause. Moments when the pressure to hold it together felt heavier than failure itself. Decisions made not from desire, but from survival. Silence chosen not out of fear, but out of responsibility. What happens when a woman becomes a symbol before she is allowed to be human? When strength becomes an expectation instead of a choice. When success arrives, but peace does not. Tonight, Egypt Sherrod finally opens up, not to shock, but to tell the truth. What was hidden until now isn't a secret meant to destroy her image. It's a reality meant to save someone else who's watching in silence. Because sometimes, the most heartbreaking stories are not the ones we see falling apart, but the ones that stayed standing long after they should have rested. Long before the cameras. Long before the titles. Long before anyone knew her name. Egypt Sherrod learned early that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. Growing up, responsibility came fast. Expectations came faster. There was little room for softness in a world that demanded maturity ahead of schedule. While other children were discovering who they were, Egypt was learning how to perform competence, how to speak clearly, move confidently, and never reveal uncertainty. It wasn't cruelty that shaped her. It was necessity. From a young age, she understood that being prepared was safer than being vulnerable. That knowledge became her shield. Her voice, her intelligence, her discipline, these weren't just talents. They were survival tools. But pressure has a way of planting seeds you don't notice until much later. Perfection became normal. Rest became optional. And failure, real or imagined, felt unacceptable. Every success raised the bar higher, and every mistake felt like proof that she had fooled everyone into believing she was capable. What people saw as confidence was often rehearsal. What they heard as certainty was often preparation masking fear. Even then, Egypt wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing stability. Validation. The quiet relief of knowing she had earned her place in the room and wouldn't be asked to leave. That drive would carry her far, but it would also follow her everywhere. Radio became her breakthrough. And her proving ground. In a space dominated by loud voices and louder egos, Egypt Sherrod carved out respect with intellect, timing, and authenticity. She wasn't just heard, she was trusted. Her voice became familiar in households she'd never enter. People listened because she sounded like she meant every word. But behind the microphone, the industry was less welcoming than it appeared. Radio demanded consistency, endurance, and emotional labor that rarely showed up on contracts. Being a woman, especially a confident, intelligent one, came with unspoken expectations. Be engaging, but not threatening. Be assertive, but not difficult. Be visible, but never too honest. Egypt learned how to navigate these contradictions quietly. There were moments she swallowed opinions to protect her position. Moments she outperformed expectations only to watch recognition stall. Moments when the room went silent after she spoke, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. The audience heard a woman in control. The woman herself felt constantly evaluated. Success came, but it came with tension. With compromises that chipped away slowly. With the realization that achievement did not guarantee security, and visibility did not guarantee safety. Still, she stayed. Because walking away felt like failure. And staying silent felt like the cost of winning. From the outside, it looked like everything aligned. A respected voice. A recognizable name. A career others dreamed of. But inside, something shifted. The job that once fueled her passion began to drain it. Creative freedom narrowed. Expectations tightened. The same voice that had built her career now felt constrained by invisible walls. Decisions were questioned. Direction was controlled. And the space to evolve felt smaller every year. Egypt didn't collapse under the pressure. She adapted. She worked harder. Smiled wider. Delivered excellence on command. But excellence without autonomy is exhausting. And over time, the gap between who she was and who she was allowed to be became unbearable. There were days she sat in silence after broadcasts, feeling hollow instead of proud. Days when applause felt distant. Days when she wondered how success could feel so confining. Leaving wasn't simple. Walking away meant risking relevance. Starting over meant confronting fear. And staying meant slowly disappearing behind expectations that no longer fit. So she endured, longer than she should have. Until the realization became impossible to ignore, the dream had changed. And if she didn't choose herself soon, the cost would be more than professional. It would be personal. Success rarely warns you before it leaves. For Egypt, it didn't arrive as a dramatic firing or a public scandal. There was no headline announcing the fall. No viral clip. No sudden disappearance. Instead, it came quietly, through delayed calls, shifting conversations, and opportunities that once felt guaranteed suddenly becoming uncertain. The momentum slowed first. Then the certainty. Meetings ended without clarity. Promises felt vague. The assurance she once carried into rooms no longer worked the same way. The industry she had given years of loyalty to began treating her as replaceable. And that realization hit harder than rejection ever could. What made it worse was the silence. No one explained what changed. No one named a mistake. There was no moment she could point to and say, "This is where I failed." And when failure has no face, it turns inward. Doubt grows. Confidence erodes. You start replaying every decision, every word, every boundary you set, wondering if asserting yourself had finally become too expensive. Egypt didn't panic publicly. She panicked privately. She questioned whether she had stayed too long, or spoken too honestly, or asked for too much. The same strength that built her reputation now felt like a liability. And in an industry that thrives on reinvention, being seen as established can quietly turn into being seen as expendable. What people didn't see was the grief. The mourning of a version of herself she had worked years to become. Letting go of a career path isn't just about losing income or visibility. It's about losing identity. And for someone who had tied purpose to performance, the collapse wasn't just professional, it was existential. She wasn't starting over by choice. She was being forced to reconsider everything. Love doesn't pause just because life gets heavy. During her professional uncertainty, Egypt's marriage became both a refuge and a pressure point. On the outside, it looked strong, supportive, stable, aspirational. People saw partnership, balance, mutual respect. What they didn't see was how stress travels. Uncertainty at work doesn't stay at work. Fear doesn't clock out. It follows you home, sits at the dinner table, creeps into conversations that have nothing to do with careers but everything to do with survival. Egypt and her husband weren't fighting each other. They were fighting the weight of expectation. The pressure to remain solid when everything else felt unstable. The unspoken responsibility of being examples for others while privately trying to hold themselves together. Some nights were quiet, not because there was peace, but because there was exhaustion. Some conversations were postponed because neither had the energy to unpack what they were feeling. And sometimes, strength looked like choosing silence instead of saying something that couldn't be taken back. Marriage doesn't break in loud moments. It strains in quiet ones. Egypt carried guilt for what she couldn't control. Fear that her struggle might become a burden. Worry that vulnerability would feel like weakness in a season that already demanded resilience. But love, real love, doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty. And learning how to ask for support, especially when you've spent a lifetime being the strong one, is its own kind of courage. This chapter wasn't about falling apart. It was about learning how not to disappear from the people who mattered most. Nothing humbles ambition like motherhood. For Egypt, being a mother was the greatest joy she had ever known, and the deepest source of internal conflict. Because no matter how much she achieved, how present she tried to be, or how hard she worked, there was always a voice whispering, "Is this enough?" She had mastered many roles. But this one came with no manual. Missed moments lingered longer than professional setbacks. A delayed bedtime story carried more weight than a missed meeting. And every time work demanded her attention, guilt followed close behind. The world praises women for doing it all. But it rarely asks what it costs them. Egypt felt torn between building a future and being present in the moment. Between providing stability and preserving connection. And the hardest truth was realizing that no matter what she chose, something always felt sacrificed. She didn't regret her ambition. She questioned the price. There were days when exhaustion made her impatient. Days when she wondered if her children would remember her presence or her absence more clearly. Days when she feared that success might one day feel like an apology she couldn't undo. Motherhood didn't weaken her, it exposed her humanity. It stripped away the illusion that control was possible and replaced it with a deeper responsibility, choosing grace for herself in moments when perfection was impossible. And slowly, she began to understand that being a good mother didn't mean being everywhere. It meant being honest, present when possible, and forgiving when not.
The body always speaks, eventually.
For years, Egypt ignored the signals. Fatigue was normal. Stress was expected. Pain was manageable. She told herself this was the price of ambition, the cost of resilience, the reality of high performance. Until her body stopped negotiating. Sleep became elusive. Energy disappeared without warning. Anxiety showed up physically, tight chest, racing thoughts, unexplained discomfort. Doctors offered tests. Results came back inconclusive. Stress was mentioned more than once, but stress is easy to dismiss when it has become your baseline. What scared her most wasn't the symptoms. It was the realization that she didn't know how to slow down. Her body was demanding what her mind refused to grant: rest, attention, honesty. Years of pushing through had accumulated into something heavier than exhaustion.
It was depletion.
For the first time, Egypt had to confront a frightening question. What if strength is what's hurting me? Healing required stillness. And stillness felt dangerous. Because when you stop moving, you're forced to feel everything you've been outrunning. Regret.
Fear. Disappointment. Grief.
This wasn't just about health. It was about survival. And in that quiet reckoning, she realized that success had nearly cost her the one thing it was supposed to enhance: her life. Faith is easy to talk about when life is working. But when the plans unravel, when certainty disappears, and when prayers feel like they echo back unanswered, faith becomes something else entirely. For Egypt, this was the season where belief stopped being inspirational and started being uncomfortable. She had always believed, trusted, leaned on faith as a compass. But now, the questions were louder than the comfort. Why would so many doors close at once? Why would clarity arrive only after exhaustion? Why did strength feel like punishment instead of reward? These weren't doubts she shared publicly. In private, she wrestled. Not with God's existence, but with God's timing. With the idea that obedience didn't guarantee ease. That doing everything right didn't prevent loss. And that sometimes, faith meant sitting in confusion without answers.
She prayed anyway.
Some prayers were hopeful. Others were angry. Some were whispered in exhaustion, asking not for success, but for peace.
For direction.
For reassurance that she wasn't being dismantled for nothing. What made this season painful wasn't the absence of faith. It was the stripping away of certainty. Faith, she learned, isn't always believing things will work out. Sometimes it's believing you can survive even if they don't. And that realization changed the way she saw strength, surrender, and purpose. This wasn't the loss of belief. It was the deepening of it. There comes a moment when staying the same feels more dangerous than changing everything. For Egypt, that moment arrived quietly, but decisively. The path she had walked for years no longer aligned with who she was becoming. The industry version of her no longer matched the woman she had grown into through struggle, loss, and reflection. Reinvention sounds empowering. In reality, it's terrifying. Starting over meant risking relevance. It meant letting go of titles people respected. It meant stepping into rooms where she wasn't known, celebrated, or immediately trusted. It meant humility after prominence, and uncertainty after expertise. But the alternative was worse. Disappearing slowly. Shrinking to fit expectations that no longer made sense. Performing a version of herself that felt dishonest. So she chose the unknown. Reinvention wasn't about ambition this time. It was about alignment. About reclaiming agency. About choosing growth over comfort, even when comfort looked successful from the outside. This chapter wasn't loud. It was deliberate. She stopped explaining herself to people who weren't invested in her healing. She released the need to be understood immediately. And she accepted that evolution often confuses those who only knew your past. Reinvention wasn't a comeback. It was a rescue. What many assumed was a pivot born out of necessity was, in truth, something much deeper. Real estate wasn't a fallback for Egypt. It was a revelation. Entering the industry meant learning a new language, earning credibility all over again, and confronting skepticism head-on. People questioned her seriousness, her longevity, her motives. Some saw a television personality playing business. Others underestimated her preparation.
They were wrong.
Real estate offered something her previous career no longer did: control.
Ownership. Tangible impact.
It allowed her to help people build security, legacy, and freedom. It connected her intellect with service, strategy with empowerment. But the transition wasn't easy. There were failures, deals that didn't close, lessons learned the hard way, moments where doubt resurfaced, whispering that starting over had been a mistake.
But unlike before, she didn't retreat. This time, she stayed present.
She studied relentlessly, asked questions without ego, built systems instead of chasing validation. And slowly, confidence returned, not the performative kind, but the grounded kind that comes from mastery. Real estate didn't just change her career. It changed her relationship with success. When television came back into her life, it looked nothing like before. The opportunity wasn't about exposure. It wasn't about proving relevance. It was about alignment. And for the first time, Egypt knew exactly what she would and wouldn't accept. Boundaries were no longer negotiable. She asked the questions she once avoided, defined expectations clearly,
Protected her time.
and refused to sacrifice well-being for visibility. The woman returning to the screen was not the one who had left.
She was clearer.
Stronger in a quieter way. Less willing to perform strength and more committed to living it.
Viewers saw confidence.
What they didn't see was the work behind it, the healing, the reflection, the decisions made when no one was watching. This return wasn't about reclaiming a platform. It was about reclaiming herself. And in doing so, Egypt discovered something powerful. Success doesn't have to cost your health, your family, or your peace. It only costs those things when you don't believe you're allowed to ask for more. Strength is praised long before it is understood. For most of her life, Egypt Sherrod was labeled strong before she ever chose to be.
It became an expectation, not a compliment.
Strength meant she could handle more, endure longer, carry weight without complaint. And over time, people stopped asking how she was doing, because strong women are assumed to be fine.
But strength, when unexamined, becomes a burden.
Egypt learned that being dependable often meant being overlooked. That showing competence invited more responsibility, not more care. And that every time she rose to the occasion without visible strain, the world quietly raised its expectations again. She rarely allowed herself to fall apart. Not because she didn't feel pain, but because she believed others needed her steady.
Family, colleagues, audiences,
even strangers who saw her as proof that success and balance were achievable. She carried their hope carefully, afraid that showing cracks would disappoint people she'd never met. The truth was simpler and harder. She didn't know how to be weak without feeling unsafe.
So she stayed strong. Through exhaustion. Through doubt.
Through moments when silence felt heavier than speaking. And in doing so, she postponed her own healing, telling herself she'd rest later, after the next milestone, the next goal, the next obligation. But strength without rest is not resilience. It's erosion. And eventually, the cost became undeniable.
Applause can be isolating.
As Egypt's visibility grew again, so did the praise. Social media celebrated her comeback. Interviews highlighted her success. Viewers saw inspiration, confidence, clarity. They saw a woman who had weathered storms and emerged stronger. What they didn't see was the quiet contradiction. Public affirmation did not erase private exhaustion. Compliments did not resolve unanswered questions. And being admired didn't mean being understood. In fact, admiration often widened the distance between who people believed she was and who she actually felt like. She smiled for photos while carrying unspoken fatigue. She delivered empowering messages while privately reminding herself to believe them. And she learned that visibility, while powerful, can also be profoundly lonely. People praised her transparency, without realizing how much she still withheld. Not because she was dishonest, but because full honesty felt risky. Vulnerability invites interpretation. And when your image becomes a source of motivation for others, revealing pain can feel like betrayal. So she edited herself. She shared lessons without scars, outcomes without process, strength without struggle. And the more she was praised, the harder it became to tell the truth, because the truth didn't fit the narrative people loved. This chapter wasn't about hypocrisy. It was about protection. Success is rarely the finish line people imagine. For years, Egypt believed that reaching certain milestones would bring peace. That once stability arrived, the tension would fade. That recognition would quiet insecurity. That achievement would heal old wounds.
It didn't.
Success amplified everything that remained unresolved. It magnified fear instead of silencing it. It exposed emotional gaps instead of filling them. And it created a strange pressure to appear grateful even when something felt missing. She learned a difficult truth: success does not replace self-worth. It only reveals whether you've built it elsewhere. There were moments when she questioned whether the chase itself had distracted her from asking deeper questions about fulfillment, identity, and rest. About who she was without the applause. About what remained when the work paused. The hardest realization wasn't that success disappointed her. It was that she had expected it to save her. And when it didn't, she had to confront the part of herself that had postponed healing in exchange for productivity. The part that believed momentum was the same as purpose. The part that thought slowing down meant falling behind. Letting go of those beliefs was painful, but necessary. Because success, she realized, is a tool, not a cure. Telling the truth changes things. For Egypt, opening up wasn't impulsive. It wasn't driven by attention or timing. It came after years of reflection, therapy, silence, and careful consideration. She didn't speak because she was healed. She spoke because she was honest. The first time she said out loud that she had struggled, it felt unfamiliar, exposing, almost disloyal to the image she had maintained. But it also felt freeing in a way success never had. She didn't reveal everything at once. She started with acknowledgement, with naming the weight, with admitting that strength had cost her more than she had realized. And in doing so, she discovered something unexpected. People weren't disappointed. They were relieved. Her truth gave others permission to breathe, to admit their own exhaustion, to stop performing wellness while quietly unraveling. And the response confirmed what she had long suspected: silence protects images, not people. Opening up didn't diminish her authority. It deepened it. Because honesty, when offered with intention, doesn't weaken a story, it completes it. And for the first time, Egypt felt aligned not just with her work, but with herself. This wasn't a confession. It was a reclamation. Silence is often mistaken for secrecy. But for Egypt, silence was protection. There were truths she carried not because she feared judgment, but because she feared consequence, not for herself, but for the people she loved. In families, in marriages, in professional spaces, honesty can sometimes wound more than it heals. And for years, Egypt chose to absorb discomfort rather than pass it on. She hid exhaustion so her children wouldn't worry. She hid fear so her partner wouldn't feel helpless. She hid disappointment so her team wouldn't feel unstable. What the world interpreted as composure was often sacrifice. She took responsibility for situations she didn't create. Shouldered blame that wasn't hers to carry. Accepted misunderstandings rather than correcting them, because correcting them would have required exposing pain she wasn't ready to share. But emotional debt compounds. Every time she chose silence, the burden grew heavier. Not because she resented others, but because she slowly disappeared from her own story. Protection became erasure. And eventually, she had to confront a hard truth. Shielding everyone else was costing her herself. Letting go of that pattern wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, painful, necessary. She learned that protecting others does not require self-abandonment. That honesty, offered with care, can strengthen rather than destroy. And that carrying everything alone is not noble, it's unsustainable. This chapter wasn't about blame. It was about boundaries. Healing is often romanticized. In reality, it is inconvenient, uncomfortable, and deeply unglamorous. For Egypt, healing didn't arrive as clarity or instant peace. It arrived as questions. As therapy sessions that reopened wounds she thought were long healed. As moments of anger she didn't recognize in herself. As grief for versions of her life that never happened. Some days felt lighter. Others felt heavier than before. Healing required unlearning habits that once kept her safe: overworking, overperforming, overgiving. It required sitting still with emotions she had avoided by staying busy. And it required admitting that survival skills don't always translate into healthy living. There were setbacks. Moments when old patterns resurfaced. Times when she wondered if honesty had complicated her life instead of improving it. But even on the hardest days, something was different. She wasn't pretending anymore. Healing didn't mean fixing everything. It meant accepting complexity. And in that acceptance, Egypt found a quieter strength. One that didn't rely on endurance, but on awareness. One that allowed rest without guilt. One that made room for joy without performance. Healing wasn't clean. But it was real. Power, she realized, had been misunderstood. For much of her life, power meant control. Influence. Achievement. The ability to withstand pressure and keep moving forward. But those definitions were shaped by systems that rewarded burnout and celebrated sacrifice without sustainability. Egypt began to redefine power on her own terms. Power became the ability to say no without explanation. To step back without apology. To choose rest even when productivity was praised. To walk away from spaces that demanded too much and gave too little.
True power, she learned, was peace.
It was showing up fully, or not at all. It was letting go of the need to prove anything. It was trusting that her value existed beyond output. This shift changed everything.
Her work became more intentional.
Her relationships more honest.
Her time more protected.
And the irony was impossible to ignore. The less she tried to appear powerful, the more grounded she became. This wasn't withdrawal. It was alignment. Legacy used to mean success. Now, it means truth. Egypt no longer measures impact by titles or visibility alone. She measures it by the conversations she starts. The women she empowers to own property, agency, and self-worth. The example she sets by choosing balance over burnout. She wants her children to remember presence, not pressure. Integrity, not image. Courage, not perfection. Her legacy is not about being admired. It's about being honest. She speaks now with intention, aware that her words reach people who feel unseen, unheard, and overwhelmed. And she doesn't offer solutions as much as permission to rest, to question, to redefine success for themselves. If her story does anything, she hopes it reminds others that they are not broken for feeling tired. That they are not weak for wanting more peace. And that starting over is not failure, it's wisdom. Every transformation requires a goodbye. Egypt didn't mourn the old version of herself with regret.
She honored her. The woman who endured. Who survived.
Who carried weight when she didn't know she could put it down. That version did her job. But she no longer needs to live there. The old Egypt believed strength meant silence. The new Egypt knows strength includes truth. The old Egypt chased approval. The new Egypt chooses alignment. The old Egypt survived. The new Egypt lives. This goodbye isn't loud.
It doesn't demand attention.
It happens quietly, in daily choices, to rest, to speak honestly, to protect her peace, to show up as human before being exceptional. And in that quiet evolution, something powerful emerges. Not a perfect ending, but an honest one.